The notebook was a dollar store composition book, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that I used to buy in bulk for my grade 3 students every September. I'd paid for it with loonies and toonies I'd been collecting for 4 months, fishing them out of my coat pocket before my husband could ask what I'd spent at the grocery store, dropping them one by one into the empty Metamucil container I kept behind the cleaning supplies under the bathroom sink. $37.50, gathered coin by coin over the course of a Canadian winter, hidden in a place my husband would never look because he'd never once cleaned a bathroom in 41 years of marriage. When my husband asked why I seemed distracted that Tuesday evening, why I kept losing my place in the conversation, why my hands fumbled when I poured his decaf, I thought about that notebook. And for the first time in years, I held his gaze and said I was just tired from shoveling the walk. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his program. He didn't question it. He never questioned anything that confirmed his idea of me as a woman growing slower, quieter, less. But the notebook held everything. Dates, amounts, the things he said, the things I'd stopped being allowed to do. Evidence, my daughter would have called it, if I'd been able to talk to her. It started the way my doctor once described hardening of the arteries. So gradually you don't notice until something stops working. My husband Robert retired from his position as a senior accountant at a municipal firm in Kitchener the spring I turned 63. We'd been married since 1983, raised 2 children in the same 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood near the Grand River, and I'd spent 31 years teaching elementary school before my own retirement 2 years earlier. I thought his retirement would mean travel, maybe finally driving out to see our son in Victoria, or taking the train to Montreal for our anniversary the way we'd talked about since the kids were small. I thought we'd finally have the same schedule, the same mornings, the same slow Saturdays at the farmer's market, the way other couples our age seem to manage. Instead, retirement gave my husband a project, and that project was me. At first, the questions seemed like interest. Where are you going this morning? Who are you meeting? What time will you be back? After 31 years of school bells and report cards, he wanted to know my movements, and I told myself it was sweet, that he just wasn't used to having company during the day. He'd always been methodical, organized. He'd spent decades managing budgets and auditing files, and now he simply needed something to manage. I told myself it would pass once he found a rhythm. But the questions didn't stop. They sharpened. Why did you stop at that bakery on King Street? We have bread at home. Who called this afternoon? I don't recognize that number. Why are you signing up for that watercolor class? $60 for 8 sessions is $60 we don't need to be spending. You never finished anything like that. Why start now? He wasn't wrong that I'd never finished a painting class. But I'd never started one either, because every time I'd suggested it over the years, he'd found a reason it wasn't practical. I didn't understand until later that this was the same reason. The finances came next, and they came the way he did everything, with a spreadsheet and a rationale that sounded reasonable on the surface. We should consolidate, he said one evening in October, setting his laptop on the kitchen table between us like a presentation. It makes no sense to have money in 4 different places. The tax implications alone. He walked me through columns and projections with the same calm authority he'd used in boardrooms for decades, and I sat across from him and felt the familiar pull of his competence, the old reflex that said he understood money and I understood children, and those were simply our respective domains. I want to keep my own account, I said. I've had it since before we were married. My mother helped me open it. There's no practical reason, he said, not unkindly, not with interest rates where they are. And it makes the bookkeeping simpler. He wasn't yelling. He never yelled. He was just so certain, and I was so tired of being the one who made things complicated, that I signed the forms he slid across the table and watched my account, the one I'd opened at 22 with my first teaching paycheck, get folded quietly into his. My Canada pension plan payments went into that account. My old age security went in. The small amount from my teacher's pension topped it up to something comfortable, money I had earned over 3 decades of other people's children. All of it now lived somewhere with only his name on the statements. He gave me $200 every 2 weeks for what he called household incidentals, groceries, toiletries, anything the house needed day to day. If I needed more, I asked. If I asked, I explained. $8 for a sympathy card and postage for my friend Diane's mother's funeral. Margaret, we could have sent flowers from the garden. It's December, I said. He gave me the $8 and wrote it in his notebook. He kept a notebook too, I realized later. His was a leather-bound ledger from Staples, and every dollar I spent was recorded in his handwriting under a column he'd labeled discretionary. I stopped going to my Thursday morning walk with the retired teachers group because they always ended at a cafe on Weber Street, and a coffee and a muffin was $4.50 I'd have to account for. I let my membership in the library's book club lapse because the year-end dinner cost $20, and $20 required a conversation I didn't have the energy for anymore. I stopped contributing to the community school garden I'd helped start when I was still teaching, because even the small annual fee felt like something I'd have to defend. My world got quieter. My husband filled the silence with scheduling. He drove me to my medical appointments and waited in the car, which meant I had to come out when he texted rather than lingering to ask the doctor a question I'd forgotten to mention. He suggested I didn't need my own cell plan, since he could add me to his account and check the usage together, and somehow I agreed before I understood what agreeing meant. He reviewed my emails because we're married and there shouldn't be secrets in a marriage, and I let him because by then I'd forgotten what it had felt like to have something that was only mine. My daughter Claire, who lives in Halifax with her husband and our 2 grandchildren, called less and less. My husband often answered when she rang the house line, and the conversations were brief and somehow never passed to me in a natural way. He'd say I was resting, or I was in the bath, or I'd just stepped out. I believed for a long time that she was just busy. Later I learned she'd started thinking I was pulling away from her on purpose. My son David and Victoria still called occasionally on Sunday evenings, but those calls happened when my husband was usually also in the room, sitting in his chair with his book open, and there are things you can't say to your son with your husband 3 feet away. The breaking point came on a Thursday in February. I was at the Zehrs on Fairway Road, the big one near the expressway, doing the weekly grocery run. The cart was modest. I'd learned to be careful, to put things back if the total was climbing, to skip the brand names for the no-name, to skip the no-name if the store brand was cheaper still. I had my $200 for the 2-week period, and I'd already used $60 of it on the gas bill for my husband's car. At the checkout, the cashier scanned everything through, and the total came up at $153 and change. I had $140 in my wallet. I stood there. The woman behind me had a toddler in the cart seat and a look of distracted patience, and the cashier, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, waited without expression. I started calculating out loud without meaning to the chicken. Yes, the crackers I could put back, the cream I'd bought because my husband takes it in his coffee and the store brand made him complain, the blood pressure medication I'd picked up from the pharmacy counter on the way through, which was $38 that I'd already counted as spent. I set the cream aside. I put back the crackers and a package of soup mix. The new total was $147. I was still short. I went through my coat pockets and found a crumpled $5 and some change. The young man at the cash didn't say anything, but the woman behind me made a small sound, not unkind, not cruel, just the sound of someone watching something uncomfortable and not knowing what to do. I found enough. I wheeled the cart to the car with my ears hot and my hands unsteady, and I sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes before I was steady enough to drive. That night I lay in bed listening to my husband breathe, and I thought about my 31 years of teaching. I thought about the children I'd sat with on carpet squares and shown how to hold a pencil and told over and over that they were capable of more than they believed. I thought about the union dues I'd paid, the professional development weekends, the classroom supplies I'd bought with my own money because the school board budget never stretched far enough. I thought about the pension I had earned and where it was going every month and what I was allowed to use of it without asking permission. I was 64 years old, and I had sat in a grocery store checkout lane and counted change in front of a stranger. The next morning, while my husband was at his weekly retired accountant's breakfast, a standing Thursday commitment he kept with the same punctuality he applied to everything I got in the car, I told myself I was going to the pharmacy to ask a question about my prescription. That was technically true, but I drove to the public library on Queen Street first. I had been going to that library for 20 years, mostly for myself but also to donate books from the school and occasionally to help with the children's reading program after I retired. The librarian who ran the front desk, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia who I'd always liked, looked up when I came in and smiled. I almost turned around. Instead, I asked her if she could help me find some information, and something in the way I said it too carefully, too quietly made her step around the desk and suggest we sit in the reading alcove at the back. I don't know exactly what I said. I remember describing the finances, the $200, the account. I remember saying he's never hit me, never even raised his voice, and hearing Patricia say gently, "Margaret, that doesn't mean it isn't serious." I remember her finding a pamphlet in the bottom drawer of the periodicals desk, the kind of pamphlet that doesn't advertise itself, that you'd never know to look for unless someone knew where to keep it. Waterloo Region Women's Services, it said, and below that, a number and an address on Frederick Street. My grandmother had a friend who needed something like this once, Patricia said, pressing the pamphlet flat between her palms before she handed it to me. A long time ago, before anyone had words for it. I always keep a few of these around, just in case. I drove home and tucked the pamphlet inside the Metamucil container with the coins. The following Thursday, I told my husband I was going to the drugstore and then perhaps to the library. Both true. He nodded without looking up from his desk, where he was updating his ledger, and I felt the strange suspension of guilt and relief that had become my most familiar emotional state. The office on Frederick Street was up a flight of stairs above a dry cleaner, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times without knowing it was there. The reception area had low lighting and chairs that looked chosen deliberately soft, unhurried, the opposite of a waiting room designed to move people through quickly. A woman came out to greet me almost immediately, as though she'd been listening for the door. Her name was Susan. She had the kind of calm that doesn't come from nothing, the calm of someone who has sat with a great deal of pain and learned not to be frightened by it. She brought me tea in a ceramic mug and waited while I found my way into the story. It took a while. It always sounds smaller out loud, I said apologetically, than it feels on the inside. What you're describing, Susan said, has a name. Financial abuse, coercive control. It's recognized under Canadian law, specifically under the Federal Intimate Partner Violence Framework, and in Ontario it's addressed under the domestic violence provisions of the Family Law Act. You are not overreacting. I thought about my 31 years of telling children they weren't stupid when they felt stupid. I thought about how rarely I'd been the one receiving that. We met every Thursday for the next 10 weeks. Susan connected me with a family law lawyer named Andrea, who worked with a legal aid clinic connected to the region of Waterloo. Andrea was brisk and thorough and explained things with the same patient clarity I'd always tried to bring to mathematics with a child who was struggling. She told me that my CPP and OAS were my income. She told me that I had a legal right to half of all assets accumulated during the marriage, including my husband's municipal pension and the investment accounts he'd been managing under his own name. She told me that leaving safely was possible, and that there were supports in place that most people didn't know about until they needed them. I needed them. There was a transition house on a residential street not far from Belmont Village, run by a woman named Joan, who'd been operating it for 17 years. 4 private rooms, shared kitchen and living space for women over 55 who were rebuilding. The subsidized rate was $120 a week, which Susan helped me arrange through a transitional assistance fund the organization administered for women in exactly my situation. I wouldn't have to ask my husband for money to leave him. The documents came first. My husband kept everything in a fireproof box in the closet of the room he used as a home office. Our marriage certificate, my birth certificate, the deed to the house, the statements for his investment accounts, the pension documentation from his former employer, insurance papers, the records from my teacher's pension that he'd filed away when I retired, saying he'd handle the paperwork. I didn't know where the key was. It took me 3 Thursdays to find it, taped inside the back cover of a tax reference book on the 3rd shelf of his bookcase, the kind of hiding place an accountant would choose because no one else would think to look there. On a Thursday morning when he was at breakfast, I opened the box and carried everything to the FedEx on King Street and made copies of everything I could find. The woman at the counter helped me work the machine when my hands made it difficult. She didn't ask questions. I returned everything to the box before he was home, and that night I made shepherd's pie for dinner, and he talked about a podcast he'd been listening to, and I said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments, And inside, I was something I hadn't been in a long time. I was a woman with a plan. The hardest part was the notebook. Not mine, his. I'd noticed him updating it at the kitchen table one evening and understood without him telling me that he was tracking something more than household expenses. I found it in his desk drawer on one of the Thursdays when he was out, and I stood in his office in my winter socks and read 17 months of notes in his careful hand. Every dollar I'd spent, categorized. Grocery variance above projected. Medical copays review necessity. Bakery charge, unexplained address with M. There was a column at the far right of each monthly page. He'd written it in red pen, and it took me a moment to understand what I was reading. Estimated cost of maintaining current arrangement versus alternatives. He had calculated, in the precise way of a man who had spent his career assigning value to expenditures, how much I cost him to keep. I photographed every page with my phone before I put the notebook back. I told Andrea about the notebook at our next meeting. She was quiet for a moment, then she said that what I'd shown her would be significant. That a document in my husband's own handwriting, demonstrating that he had reduced our marriage to a cost-benefit ledger, was exactly the kind of evidence that changed a judge's reading of a case. We chose a Tuesday in March. My husband had a cardiologist appointment at the Heart Health Clinic at Grand River Hospital every 6 weeks, a thorough appointment with blood work and monitoring that reliably kept him occupied for the better part of a morning. He was particular about those appointments, never late, never hurried. He would be gone at minimum 3 hours. The night before, I made his usual dinner, pan-fried salmon with the lemon dill sauce he preferred, and I sat across from him in the kitchen we had shared for 31 years, and I was mostly calm. There was something underneath the calm that felt unfamiliar, and it took me until I was washing the dishes to identify it. It was the particular quiet of a decision already made. Tuesday morning I made his breakfast. Oatmeal, brown sugar, half a grapefruit, coffee with cream, the same breakfast I had made him since the children were small, because he said routine was good for the heart. He read the globe on his tablet and mentioned that the weather was improving, finally, and that he might rake the backyard that weekend. I said that sounded like a good idea. He kissed me on the cheek when he left. He did that every morning, a single, brief press of lips against cheekbone, no different from the way he'd been doing it for 4 decades. I closed the door behind him. I stood in the front hallway for a moment. Then I went to the back of the coat closet, where I had been keeping the old Samsonite carry-on I'd bought at the Goodwill on Cortlandt Avenue 6 weeks earlier, paying $22 for it in cash from the coins I'd saved. I'd told my husband I'd donated a bag of winter coats and returned with a receipt, which was true. I simply hadn't mentioned that I'd also come home with something. I packed carefully. I'd been deciding for weeks what mattered enough to carry. 2 pairs of slacks, 3 tops, a cardigan my mother had knitted for me decades ago that I'd kept folded in a box at the back of my closet for years because my husband said the color was unflattering, my reading glasses, and a spare pair. The photographs I'd transferred from the hallway frames to an envelope, the ones from when the children were young, Claire's kindergarten picture and David's first hockey game, and a photograph of my parents in their garden that someone had taken the summer before my mother died. My grandmother's brooch, small and garnet, which my husband had never liked and therefore never thought about. My own passport, which I'd found in the document box and quietly kept. Everything precious to me fit in a bag I could lift with one arm. 64 years of a life, and what mattered most weighed almost nothing. Joan's volunteer driver, a retired nurse named Beverly who did this on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, was parked at the end of the street at 9:45, just as we'd arranged. Beverly was 68 and had silver hair cut very short and wore a down vest despite the March thaw, as though she simply didn't trust the weather yet. She got out of the car when she saw me and put the bag in her trunk without being asked. "Ready?" she said. I took one look back at the house. The red brick, the cedar hedge my husband trimmed every August with the level he kept in the garage specifically for that purpose, the window of the kitchen where I had stood 10,000 mornings. Then I got in the car. The transition house on Benton Street was a brick semi-detached in a row of similar houses, quiet and unassuming. Joan was waiting at the side door, which Beverly explained was how arrivals were always handled through the side, not the front. Joan was in her early 60s, solid and warm, with the manner of someone who had seen the full range of human circumstances and arrived at a policy of simple, practical kindness. She showed me the room. It was small, a single bed with a blue duvet, a dresser, a closet, a window with a thin curtain over the view of the backyard. There was a reading lamp on the nightstand and a small bookshelf with a row of paperbacks, a mix of mysteries and a couple of Margaret Lawrence novels, which made me feel that whoever had chosen them had understood something about who might arrive. "Bathroom is just down the hall," Joan said. "Kitchen and common room are on the main floor. There are 2 other women here right now, good people. Dinner's at 6 if you want to join, no pressure. It's your space." After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and cried. Not from fear, from the particular, flooding relief of having done something you weren't sure you had the courage to do. My husband called my cell phone 49 times that afternoon. I'd brought it with me, something the original plan had left uncertain, and when the calls started, I sat in the reading chair by the window and watched the screen light up again and again with his name, each call going to voicemail, and I felt something settle inside me like sediment in still water. He called Joan's main line, which he'd found somehow. She told me later he'd been methodical about it, working through any number that might connect to women's services in the region. Joan answered once and told him only that she couldn't confirm or deny information about any resident, and that if he had legal concerns, he should contact his solicitor. He called Service Canada asking to redirect my CPP payments. Andrea had already placed a protective flag on the file when she filed my initial legal separation paperwork that same morning. The woman at the Service Canada office told him that any changes to benefit payment direction required the consent of the recipient. He apparently argued this point for 20 minutes. He called the Waterloo Regional Police claiming I was a missing person with possible cognitive decline. A constable called Andrea's office to confirm my status. Andrea confirmed that I was 64 years old, mentally competent, had left voluntarily, and was represented by legal counsel. That was the end of that. What he didn't do, the thing that told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage had become, was call Claire. He had her number. He'd had it all along. He called David in Victoria and said, "Your mother has had some kind of episode. She's not thinking clearly. You need to talk to her." But he didn't call Claire until the following day, and only then to say she'd gone and he didn't know where, and that he suspected I'd been manipulated by people who were taking advantage of me. Claire called Andrea's office within the hour. She'd been sending letters, she told Andrea through tears, for 3 years. Birthday cards to the house address, a package for Christmas, a long letter when her eldest started school, because she'd wanted me to know. She'd assumed I was receiving them. She'd assumed I was choosing not to respond, and she'd been grieving what she thought was a slow withdrawal of her mother's love. My husband had intercepted every one. The separation proceedings took 8 months. He challenged the asset division, the support claim, the legal standing of the documentation I'd provided. His lawyer described me as a confused older woman who had been manipulated by advocacy organizations with a political agenda. He suggested my memory was unreliable. He questioned whether I understood what I had signed. Andrea presented the notebook. The family court judge, a woman named Justice Okafor, who had clearly been on the bench long enough to have encountered every variety of marital revisionism, spent several minutes with the notebook before she set it down on her desk. She did not look at my husband when she did it. She looked at me. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, the division of net family property is calculated from the date of marriage to the date of separation. My husband's pension from his accounting firm, his RRSP, his TFSA, the equity in the house, the non-registered investment portfolio he'd been building since the early 90s, all of it was subject to equalization. After 29 years of his income considerably exceeding mine and the asset accumulation reflecting that, the equalization payment he owed me was substantial. I was awarded spousal support of $2,500 per month for a period of 5 years, at which point my CPP, OAS, and teacher's pension together would provide sufficient income. I was awarded half the equity in the house, which would require him to either sell it or refinance to pay my share. My CPP and OAS were reinstated in direct deposit to a new account in my name only, at a credit union on the recommendation of Andrea, who pointed out that sometimes a fresh institution is simply easier. The order was signed on a Thursday afternoon in November. Andrea and I sat in the courthouse parking lot afterward in her car, and she turned the heat up because it was already cold and said, sincerely, that this was a good outcome, that she was glad I'd come in when I did. I thanked her. I meant something larger than the word could hold. I was still at Joan's place when the order was finalized. I could afford my own apartment by then. There was a reasonable 2-bedroom on Wilson Avenue that I'd been to see, with a gas fireplace and enough room for when the grandchildren visited. But I wasn't ready to leave. I liked the kitchen with its shared coffee at 7:30 in the morning. I liked the woman named Rita from the next room, who was 67 and rebuilding after her own particular version of this kind of story, and who had introduced me to a card game I'd never heard of that she'd learned from her Guyanese grandmother. I liked being somewhere that the fact of what had happened to me wasn't something I had to explain, because everyone already understood. And I liked being useful. I sat with the new women who came through. I made tea, I said, in the same voice I'd used for 31 years with children who had stopped believing they were capable. You can leave. It won't be easy, but you can. And there are people here who will help you. Claire flew to Kitchener in December, the first week of her daughter's school break. She stood in the doorway of Joan's common room with her coat still on and her eyes wet, and I crossed the room to her, and we held on to each other for a long time without saying anything, which was the right thing because there was too much to say, and all of it could wait for later, for the many later conversations we were already making plans for. She asked me eventually why I hadn't called her. Her voice was careful, the way you make your voice careful when you're trying not to be angry and also trying not to cry. I was ashamed, I said. For a long time I was ashamed that I hadn't noticed it happening, and then I was ashamed that I'd let it go on so long, and then I was ashamed that I needed help to leave. And after all that shame, I simply forgot that I was allowed to ask. She held my hands very tightly and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My son David called from Victoria the following Sunday. He was quiet for most of the conversation, the kind of quiet that means someone is working through something they hadn't let themselves see before. He said that there were things he had noticed over the years, Christmases when I seemed smaller than he expected, phone calls where I sounded like I was choosing my words, and that he'd told himself it was just how I was getting older, that everyone changed. He said he was sorry. I told him he was not responsible for his father's choices, and that this was one of the things that takes a long time to understand, but is absolutely true. Last week I started volunteering with the reading program at the downtown library on Queen Street, the same one where Patricia had quietly handed me that pamphlet in the middle of February. I shelve books on Tuesday mornings and sit with adult learners on Thursday afternoons, helping people work through things they find difficult. It's not so different from teaching, really. The learning looks different, but the part that matters the moment when someone understands they're more capable than they thought, that part is the same. Patricia saw me coming in last Tuesday and waved from behind the desk. I waved back. I thought about thanking her again, but she'd told me before that the best thanks was using the number, which I had, and paying it forward, which I was working on. The Samsonite carry-on sits on the top shelf of my closet at Joan's. I've decided I'll keep it. Not because I plan to need it again, but because sometimes in the morning when I'm getting dressed and I happen to glance up at it, I think about the woman who packed it with trembling hands, counting her options, and finding more than she expected. I think about her sitting in the parking lot of the Zehrs on Fairway Road in February, hands on the steering wheel, deciding that she was not done yet. I want to tell her she was right. I want to tell her that 64 is not too late, that starting over is not the same as losing, that the pension she earned over 3 decades of other people's children is hers, that her name on an account no one else can access is one of the quieter and more profound pleasures of her life now. I want to tell her that her daughter's voice on the phone every Sunday evening will become one of the things she's most grateful for. But she already knew all of that. She'd known it for longer than she'd admitted. She was just waiting for the right Tuesday to finally act on it.